The bank manager said, "You emptied your account yesterday. I was in surgery yesterday for 9 hours. I stood in the Bank of America lobby on Wednesday morning with my post-operative discharge papers still in my jacket pocket, trying to understand what Christina Devereaux was telling me. She was the branch manager, a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled auburn hair and a concerned expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd called me into her office after I tried to withdraw money from my prescriptions, and now she was showing me transaction records on her computer screen that made absolutely no sense. According to her monitor, at 2:47 p.m. yesterday afternoon, someone walked into this exact branch and withdrew $43,000 from my savings account. The entire balance, cleared out in a single transaction. The withdrawal slip had my signature on it. The security footage showed someone who looked like me handing over my ID, my account information, everything. But yesterday, at 2:47 p.m., I was on an operating table at Memorial Hospital having a tumor removed from my kidney. I had 9 hours of surgery with 12 different medical professionals who could verify my exact location during every second of that withdrawal. Christina pulled up the security footage and turned her monitor so I could see it better. The man on screen wore a navy jacket similar to mine, had short dark hair like mine, and moved with a confidence that suggested he belonged there. The camera angle didn't capture his face clearly, just the top of his head and his hands as he filled out forms. But those hands had my watch on them. My father's vintage Omega Seamaster that he'd given me before he died. My college ring with the engineering insignia I'd worn for 15 years. The man was wearing my jewelry. My hands started shaking as I watched the footage. Christina kept talking about fraud protection protocols and how they'd need to investigate before restoring funds, but her words became background noise. Someone had studied me carefully enough to replicate my watch, my jacket, my signature, my mannerisms. Someone had walked into this bank with my identification and my account information and stolen everything I had while I was unconscious and being cut open 3 miles away. I pulled out my phone and showed Christina my hospital wristband, still on my arm. I showed her the discharge papers with the timestamp showing I'd been released at 6:30 a.m. this morning. I pulled up the surgical consent forms I'd signed 2 days ago, listing the procedure, the expected duration, the risks. Christina looked at everything with the same professional concern, making notes on her tablet, but something in her expression suggested she didn't entirely believe me. "Your signature matches exactly," she said, pointing to the withdrawal slip on her screen. "And the man knew your account password, your security questions, everything. He answered questions about your first pet's name, your mother's, maiden name, details only you should know. I understand you're saying you were in surgery, but we need documentation from the hospital. Surgeon's notes, operative reports, something official that proves you couldn't have been here." I felt my face flush with anger and confusion. "You think I'm lying about having surgery? You think I somehow orchestrated withdrawing my own money and then came back the next day pretending to be confused about it? Why would I do that?" Christina's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Mr. Castellano, I'm not accusing you of anything, but we see attempted fraud every week, and sometimes people try creative approaches. I need to follow our protocols. Once you provide documentation proving you were at Memorial Hospital during the withdrawal time, we can file a formal fraud claim and begin the investigation process." I walked out of that bank feeling like the world had tilted sideways. My phone rang before I even reached my car. It was Dr. Kapoor, my surgeon, calling to check on my recovery. When I explained what just happened, she immediately offered to send over my complete surgical records, operative notes, anesthesia logs, everything time-stamped and documented. She sounded outraged on my behalf, saying she'd personally call the bank if needed. But even with her support, I felt a growing dread in my stomach that had nothing to do with my incision pain. Someone had been inside my apartment. That was the only explanation for how they had my watch, my jacket, knew my security questions, had access to my identification. I'd been so focused on preparing for surgery, on getting my medical affairs in order, that I hadn't noticed anything missing. But now, driving toward my apartment in the cold November morning, I replayed the last few weeks in my head, looking for signs I'd missed. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse building in the Arts District. I'd lived there for 2 years since my divorce, chosen it specifically because it had secure entry and good lighting and felt safe. But when I unlocked my door and stepped inside, everything looked wrong. Not obviously disturbed, nothing knocked over or ransacked, but wrong in subtle ways that made my skin crawl. The books on my shelf were in a slightly different order. My desk chair was positioned differently than I remembered. My bedroom closet door was open a crack when I always kept it closed. I went through my belongings with mounting horror. My father's watch was missing. So was my college ring, but more disturbing was what else was gone. My passport, my birth certificate, my social security card, documents I kept in a locked drawer in my desk, except the lock had been picked, the scratches around the keyhole barely visible unless you looked closely. Someone had been here, had gone through my most personal belongings, had taken things I needed to prove my identity. I called the police from my bedroom, sitting on the edge of my bed, with my incision throbbing and my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The dispatcher said an officer would come by within 2 hours to take a report. In the meantime, she suggested I check my credit reports and freeze my accounts. I spent the next 40 minutes on hold with various credit bureaus, discovering that someone had opened 3 new credit cards in my name in the past week. 2 were maxed out with charges I didn't recognize. The third had been used to buy a plane ticket to Miami yesterday afternoon, around the same time my bank account was being emptied. Officer Diana Wolf arrived at my apartment looking tired and carrying a tablet for taking notes. She was in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too many crime scenes. She walked through my apartment methodically, photographing the picked lock, the disturbed items, taking notes about what was missing. When I showed her the bank security footage on my phone and explained about my surgery, her expression shifted from routine interest to focused attention. "This is sophisticated," she said, zooming in on the footage. "Whoever did this knew your routine well enough to strike while you were guaranteed to be unavailable. They had time to go through your apartment, gather what they needed, and execute the theft, knowing you couldn't possibly interfere." She looked at me directly. "Has anyone been in your apartment recently? Maintenance workers? Delivery people? Friends who might have noticed your surgery date?" I thought about it carefully. My ex-wife Leslie had a key, but we hadn't spoken in months. My brother Nathan had been here 2 weeks ago to help me prepare for surgery, but he was the one who'd driven me to the hospital and stayed during the entire procedure. My building maintenance had done a routine inspection last month, but that was before I'd even scheduled the surgery date. Then I remembered something that made my stomach drop. "The cleaning service," I said slowly. "I hired a new cleaning service 3 weeks ago through one of those apps. A guy named Kevin Brandt came twice to deep clean before my surgery. He had my key code, full access to the apartment, was here for hours each time. Officer Wolf was already writing this down. What's the name of the service?" I pulled up the app on my phone, but when I searched for the cleaner's profile, it was gone. The entire account had been deleted. The payment history showed the charges, but the service provider's information had vanished completely. Officer Wolf made several calls while standing in my living room. I heard her talking to someone about fraudulent service providers, identity theft rings, organized crime patterns. When she finished, she turned to me with an expression that mixed sympathy and frustration. "We've been tracking a crew that operates exactly like this. They target people scheduled for major medical procedures, gain access to their homes through legitimate-seeming services, gather everything they need, and hit them during surgery when they're guaranteed to be unavailable and disoriented afterward. You're the 4th victim this month. The hospital records I provided to the bank were thorough and undeniable. Dr. Kapoor had included minute-by-minute documentation of my surgery, signed by everyone present in the OR. The bank's fraud department reviewed everything and agreed that I clearly hadn't been at the branch during the withdrawal. But that's when Christina Devereaux delivered the next devastating news. Because the thief had your correct identification, your accurate signature, and answered all security questions correctly, our insurance considers this an authorized transaction. We can file a claim, but the investigation process takes 60 to 90 days, and there's no guarantee of full reimbursement. I sat in Christina's office again, this time with my brother Nathan beside me for support, and tried to understand how I was supposed to survive for 3 months with zero savings. I'd used my emergency fund to pay for the surgery deductibles. My checking account had enough for maybe 2 weeks of basic expenses. The credit cards opened in my name were maxed out with charges I was now responsible for disputing individually. The thief had taken my identity and my financial security in one coordinated attack, and the systems designed to protect me were failing at every level. Nathan was a corporate attorney with a firm downtown, and he immediately started making calls to his contacts. By that afternoon, he'd connected me with a fraud specialist named Julian Cross, who worked with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Julian was in his 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He reviewed my case files while sitting at my kitchen table, making notes in a leather-bound notebook that looked expensive and well-used. "The cleaning service app is a front," he explained. "These crews create legitimate-looking platforms, complete with fake reviews and professional interfaces. They target specific demographics through social media monitoring, medical records they've purchased illegally, hospital employee information they've bribed out of workers. Once they identify a target with an upcoming surgery, they offer their services at a discount, gain access, and execute the theft during the procedure window. By the time the victim realizes what happened, the crew has moved to the next city." "How many cities?" I asked, my voice hollow. Julian's expression was grim. "They've hit Seattle, Portland, Denver, Phoenix, and now here in Austin. We estimate somewhere between 40 and 60 victims so far, with total losses exceeding $3 million. The problem is proving the connection between the app, the thefts, and the individuals executing them. They use encrypted communications, cryptocurrency transfers, and rotate through different identities constantly. Every time we get close, they disappear and reinvent themselves." Nathan leaned forward across the table. "But you have security footage from multiple banks, right? Can't you use facial recognition to identify the people making these withdrawals?" Julian pulled up files on his laptop, showing us grainy security footage from other banks in other cities. In Seattle, the thief wore a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face. In Portland, they wore large sunglasses and a medical mask. In Denver, the camera mysteriously malfunctioned during the exact withdrawal window. In Phoenix, the footage showed someone who looked entirely different than any previous theft. They're using makeup, prosthetics, sometimes multiple people who resemble their targets. The man in my bank footage was particularly skilled, Julian continued, pulling up the video again. He kept his head angled away from cameras, used his posture to block facial recognition software, and moved with practiced efficiency. But there's something here we can use. He zoomed in on a section of the footage showing the man's hands as he signed withdrawal forms. See this scar on his right hand? That's distinctive. And this tattoo partially visible under his sleeve. These are identifying markers he couldn't easily hide. Over the next week, while I recovered from surgery and tried to rebuild my life with borrowed money from Nathan, Julian's team worked to track the crew. They identified similar hand scars in footage from 2 other cities, confirmed the same tattoo pattern, and built a profile of their primary operator. His real name was Garrett Flynn, and he had a criminal record spanning 8 states. Identity theft, credit card fraud, forgery, and 3 outstanding warrants in jurisdictions that hadn't managed to extradite him yet. But finding Garrett wasn't enough. Julian explained that he was just the face of the operation. Someone else coordinated the targeting, managed the fake app platforms, recruited the cleaning crew members, and moved the money. Someone with technical skills and organizational capacity that suggested either law enforcement background or serious corporate crime experience. Someone who'd been operating for at least 3 years before law enforcement even identified the pattern. I went back to work 2 weeks after surgery, still healing but desperate to maintain my income. I was a mechanical engineer at an aerospace firm downtown, and my boss, Gerald Simmons, was understanding about my situation but firm about expectations. I had project deadlines, team members depending on me, and no flexibility for extended medical leave. So I worked through the pain, took my medications at my desk, and tried to pretend my entire life hadn't been upended by a man who'd cleaned my apartment and stolen my identity. That's when I started noticing the inconsistencies in my building's security. The main entrance required a key card, but the lock was damaged and anyone could force it open with enough pressure. The security cameras in the stairwells had been broken for months, marked with maintenance tags that never resulted in repairs. The management company, Riverside Properties, responded to maintenance requests with delays and excuses that suggested they were barely functional. I'd never paid much attention before, but now every security failure felt personal and deliberate. I started documenting everything. I photographed the broken entrance lock, the disabled cameras, the maintenance tags with dates showing weeks of neglect. I pulled up my rental agreement and found clauses about security provisions that Riverside Properties was clearly violating. Nathan looked over my documentation and his expression hardened. "This is negligence," he said flatly. "They advertised this building as secure, you paid premium rent based on that security, and they failed to maintain basic protections that could have prevented your theft. We sent a formal legal letter to Riverside Properties demanding they address the security failures and accept liability for damages." Their response came from an attorney named Gregory Hunt, who specialized in defending property management companies. His letter was dismissive and aggressive, claiming no responsibility for criminal acts committed by third parties and threatening countersuits if we pursued litigation. Nathan read his response aloud in my apartment, his voice tight with anger. "He's gambling that you don't have the resources to fight them. Most victims can't afford extended legal battles against corporate entities with deep pockets." But Nathan had something Gregory Hunt didn't anticipate. He'd been building a class action case against negligent property management companies for 2 years, gathering victims, documenting patterns, and waiting for the right opportunity to file. My case was perfect. Clear documentation of security failures, direct connection between those failures and criminal access, and now evidence that the same crew had targeted residents in other Riverside Properties buildings across multiple cities. Julian Cross confirmed that 4 other victims in his investigation lived in buildings managed by Riverside Properties or their subsidiary companies. Same broken security patterns, same delayed maintenance, same access points that the theft crew exploited. It wasn't coincidence. The crew was specifically targeting Riverside buildings because they knew security would be inadequate and residents would be vulnerable. Within 3 weeks, Nathan filed a class action lawsuit against Riverside Properties on behalf of 17 victims across 4 states. The lawsuit alleged systematic negligence, false advertising of security features, and creating environments that enabled criminal enterprises. The local news picked up the story, running segments about the identity theft ring and the property management company that made their crimes possible. Suddenly, my personal nightmare became a public scandal. Gregory Hunt's aggressive dismissiveness vanished. Riverside Properties issued statements about being committed to resident safety while simultaneously trying to settle quietly with individual victims. They offered me $50,000 to drop out of the class action and sign an NDA. Nathan advised me to refuse, explaining that the publicity was our leverage and accepting their hush money would undermine everyone else's case. So I refused, and watched as Riverside's public relations situation deteriorated daily. The bank finally approved my fraud claim 6 weeks after the theft. They restored my account balance, but the damage to my credit from the fraudulent cards was still my responsibility to repair. I spent hours on the phone with credit agencies, filing disputes, submitting documentation, navigating systems designed to be as difficult as possible. Each conversation required me to relive the theft, explain the timeline, justify why I hadn't noticed the security breaches sooner. My apartment still didn't feel safe. I'd changed the locks, installed additional cameras, and verified that Riverside had finally repaired the building's security systems after the lawsuit publicity forced their hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside my most private space, had touched my belongings, had studied my life carefully enough to become me for the purposes of theft. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. Nathan noticed my increasing paranoia during one of his visits. He sat on my couch with a beer, watching me check the door locks for the third time in an hour. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "They've moved on to another city, and even if they hadn't, they wouldn't risk returning to a victim who's cooperating with federal investigators." But I couldn't let it go. What if Kevin Brandt wasn't working alone inside my apartment? What if he'd made copies of things I hadn't noticed missing? What if he'd installed hidden cameras or recording devices I hadn't found? I hired a security specialist named Troy Dixon to sweep my apartment for surveillance equipment. Troy was former military with expertise in counterintelligence and electronic surveillance detection. He spent 4 hours going through every room with specialized equipment, checking outlets, light fixtures, smoke detectors, anywhere a camera or microphone could hide. He found 3 devices, one in my bedroom smoke detector, one in my bathroom exhaust fan, and one in my living room behind a picture frame. They'd been watching me for weeks before the theft, studying my routines, documenting my schedule, preparing for the surgical window when I'd be most vulnerable. Troy bagged the devices as evidence, and I immediately called Officer Wolf. She arrived with a digital forensics team who analyzed the surveillance equipment and discovered they were connected to a cloud storage account registered to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. The footage history showed recordings dating back 4 weeks before my surgery. Hours and hours of my private life, documented and analyzed by strangers who used that information to destroy my financial security. Julian Cross used the surveillance evidence to finally trace the Shell Corporation's ownership structure. It led through 3 different offshore companies, multiple layers of legal protection, and eventually to a name that made my blood run cold. Leslie Castellano, my ex-wife, the woman I'd divorced 2 years ago after discovering her affair with her personal trainer, the woman who'd fought viciously over asset division and lost, the woman who'd sworn during our final court appearance that I'd regret leaving her. Officer Wolf brought Leslie in for questioning 3 days later. I watched through one-way glass as she sat in the interrogation room looking different than I remembered. Her hair was shorter and dyed blonde, and her face had the sharp quality of someone who'd lost weight quickly. Julian Cross led the interrogation with methodical precision, presenting evidence piece by piece. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the surveillance equipment purchased using Leslie's credit history, wire transfers that connected her accounts to the cleaning service app's payment processing, phone records showing communications with known members of Garrett Flynn's theft crew. Leslie initially claimed she'd been hacked, that someone was framing her, that she had no knowledge of any theft operation. But Julian had recovered deleted emails from Leslie's cloud backup showing detailed planning discussions. Leslie had been tracking my social media, noticed posts about my upcoming surgery, and connected with the theft crew through dark web forums where she'd been active since our divorce. She'd provided them with my personal information, my routine, my security vulnerabilities, everything they needed to execute the theft. In exchange, she received 40% of the proceeds. The surgery date wasn't coincidental, Julian explained during a break in the interrogation. Leslie knew exactly when you'd be most vulnerable because you'd posted about it on a private Facebook group for people dealing with similar medical issues. She'd gained access to that group using a fake profile, pretending to be going through the same health concerns. She'd been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to financially destroy you while ensuring she couldn't be directly connected to the crime. I felt sick watching Leslie through the glass. This was beyond vindictive divorce behavior. This was calculated financial terrorism from someone who'd once promised to love me forever, someone who'd slept beside me for 8 years, who'd met my family, who I'd trusted with the most intimate parts of my life, and she'd used all that knowledge to orchestrate my violation in the most comprehensive way possible. Leslie eventually broke under the weight of evidence and cut a deal with prosecutors. She'd testify against Garrett Flynn and his crew in exchange for reduced charges. She'd provide account information that would help recover funds stolen from other victims. She'd admit her role in the conspiracy and accept a 5-year prison sentence with mandatory restitution. Julian assured me it was the best outcome possible, but watching Leslie sign the plea agreement felt hollow. 5 years for destroying my sense of safety, my financial security, my ability to trust that my private spaces were actually private. The FBI arrested Garrett Flynn in Miami 4 months after my surgery. They caught him preparing to strike another victim, a man recovering from spinal surgery whose apartment Garrett had accessed through another fake cleaning service. This time, the FBI had surveillance in place, documented everything, and moved in before Garrett could execute the theft. They found my father's watch in his possession, along with identification documents from 15 other victims and nearly $200,000 in cash. Garrett's arrest led to 6 other crew members across 4 states. The cleaning service app was shut down, the offshore accounts were frozen, and prosecutors built cases that would put the entire operation away for decades. Julian called me personally with updates throughout the process, his voice carrying satisfaction as each arrest was made. By the time trial dates were set, they'd connected the crew to 83 victims and nearly $5 million in stolen funds. The class action lawsuit against Riverside Properties settled 8 months after Nathan filed it. The company agreed to pay $12 million to victims, implement mandatory security upgrades across all properties, and submit to 3 years of independent monitoring to ensure compliance. Gregory Hunt's aggressive posturing had collapsed under the weight of evidence showing Riverside had deliberately cut security costs to maximize profits while advertising premium safety features. The settlement gave me enough to rebuild my emergency fund, pay off the fraudulent debts, and cover therapy costs for dealing with the trauma. But money didn't fix everything. I moved out of the Riverside building as soon as the settlement came through, found a new apartment in a different neighborhood with visible security and responsive management. I changed my phone number, deleted social media accounts, and became extremely careful about who had access to my personal information. I started therapy with Dr. Nina Wallace, who specialized in trauma from identity theft and helped me work through the violation of having been watched and studied without my knowledge. The trial for Garrett Flynn and his crew was scheduled for late spring. I was listed as a prosecution witness, required to testify about the theft, the surveillance, Leslie's involvement. My attorney, provided through the Victims Assistance Program, prepared me for cross-examination and warned me that defense attorneys would try to suggest I'd been careless with my information or should have noticed the security failures sooner. Nathan promised to be there every day of the trial, sitting behind me in the gallery. 3 days before trial was scheduled to begin, I received a call from Julian Cross. His voice was tight with anger. Garrett Flynn had been found dead in his cell at the county jail, an apparent suicide. He'd hanged himself using bedsheets, and nobody had noticed until morning checks. But Julian didn't believe it was suicide. Garrett had been cooperating with prosecutors, providing information about larger criminal networks he'd connected with during his operations. Someone had wanted him silenced before he could testify about those connections. The other crew members immediately lawyered up and stopped cooperating. Without Garrett's testimony, prosecutors had weaker cases against the higher-level coordinators who'd financed and organized the operation. Several plea deals were renegotiated, sentences were reduced, and people I'd been told would face decades in prison were suddenly looking at 3 to 5 years. Julian was furious, but helpless. The system had failed again, and the people who'd orchestrated my violation were escaping with minimal consequences. Leslie served 18 months before being released on parole for good behavior. I found out through Nathan, who'd been monitoring her case. She was required to pay restitution of $43,000 plus interest, but she'd claimed bankruptcy and had no assets to garnish. The restitution order was essentially meaningless. She was also required to stay away from me under a restraining order, but enforcement of such orders was notoriously inconsistent. I bought better locks, installed security cameras, and tried not to think about my ex-wife being free while I was still dealing with the aftermath of her crimes. My surgery recovery took longer than expected. The tumor removal was successful, but complications from the stress of everything that followed created additional health problems. I developed chronic pain in my side, panic attacks triggered by unexpected noises, and insomnia that made it hard to function at work. Gerald at the aerospace firm was understanding but limited in what accommodations he could provide. I eventually reduced my hours to part-time, accepting the financial hit because my health couldn't sustain the full-time pressure. Nathan kept fighting. He used the publicity from the Riverside case to advocate for stronger tenant protection laws, better security requirements for property management companies, and improved victim support systems for identity theft. He testified before state legislature committees, wrote opinion pieces for newspapers, and became a voice for people who'd been violated by systems that prioritized profit over safety. Watching him channel anger into activism helped me feel less helpless. I got my father's watch back 14 months after it was stolen. The FBI returned it as part of closing their evidence files, now that appeals had been exhausted and remaining cases were resolved. The watch was in a plastic evidence bag with a tag detailing its journey through the criminal justice system. I'd thought having it back would bring closure, but wearing it again just reminded me of Garrett Flynn's hands on it, of how he'd studied my belongings carefully enough to replicate my personal style. Troy Dixon, the security specialist, became an unexpected friend. He checked in regularly after sweeping my apartment, offered advice on personal safety measures, and eventually invited me to grab a beer just to talk about something other than crime and violation. He'd dealt with his own trauma during military service and understood the long process of rebuilding a sense of security after it's been shattered. We started meeting weekly, conversations that slowly shifted from security concerns to normal life topics, creating something that felt almost like the beginning of trust. 2 years after the surgery, I stood in my new apartment on a Saturday morning making coffee and realized I'd slept through the entire night for the first time in months. The chronic pain had diminished through physical therapy and stress management. The panic attacks were less frequent and less severe. I'd learned to live with locks and cameras and heightened awareness without letting fear consume every moment. The violation hadn't disappeared, but I'd built a life around it that felt manageable and sometimes even good. Nathan called that morning with news that Texas had passed new legislation requiring property management companies to maintain working security systems or face criminal negligence charges if crimes occurred due to their failures. It was directly inspired by our case, written with input from victims Nathan had organized into an advocacy group. The law wouldn't undo what happened to me, but it might prevent the same violation from happening to someone else. That felt like a kind of justice, even if it wasn't the justice I'd originally wanted. Leslie violated her parole 6 months after release and was sent back to prison to serve her remaining sentence. Officer Wolf called to tell me personally, her voice carrying satisfaction. She'd been caught running a credit card fraud scheme, unable to stop the criminal behavior that had destroyed her life and mine. This time there would be no early release, no plea deal, no shortcuts. She'd serve every day of her sentence, and when she got out, she'd be a registered felon with limited opportunities and constant monitoring. The system had finally caught up with her. I never fully recovered the person I was before the surgery and theft. That version of me had trusted that locked doors meant safety, that security systems worked, that medical vulnerability wouldn't be exploited by people I'd invited into my home. The person I became was more careful, more guarded, more aware of the ways systems fail and people exploit those failures. But I was also stronger, more resilient, more determined to help others avoid the same violation. I volunteered with victim advocacy groups, shared my story with medical patients preparing for surgery, and worked with Nathan's organization to push for better protections. 3 years after waking from surgery to discover my life had been stolen, I received notification that the bankruptcy court had garnished funds from Leslie's prison commissary account. $17 toward the $43,000 she owed me. It was simultaneously laughable and satisfying, proof that the system was at least making token efforts at justice. I deposited the check and used it to buy drinks for Troy on our weekly meetup, transforming blood money into something that felt human and normal. The scars from my surgery faded to silver lines across my side. The scars from the theft were less visible but equally permanent, written into my behavior patterns and trust calculations. I learned to live with both, accepting that some violations leave marks you carry forever, but don't have to let define you completely. I built a smaller life than I'd planned, more cautious and less open, but also more authentic and more mine. Nobody could steal that from me again, because I'd constructed it from the ruins of what they'd taken, made it stronger, made it last.